Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 513 Sports Attack.
My name is Nick, and with me, as always, my partner in crime, Cory.
What's going on?
Not much, man. Just being in the holiday season, feeling in good spirits, I'd figured, no rant today. No rant. Instead, we're going to dedicate this entire episode to a review, a year review and a decade review. So I'd like to start off with just giving a 2019 review. And, we kicked off this year, Cory, with crowning a college football champion in Clemson, beating Alabama. Then you fast forward, a month later to February, where magnificent number 12 Tom Brady does Tom Brady things, winning his 6th Super Bowl, which is unheard. I mean, he stands alone at number 2.
Unreal. Unreal. GOAT doing GOAT things.
Yeah, just GOAT doing GOAT things in February. And then March comes with March Madness. You saw a year ago in 2018, we saw the biggest upset ever.
Any sport, ever.
Sport. And UMBC beating Virginia 16 over a number 1. I never thought I was ever going to see it. And I was so glad that I watched that game because it was amazing. But then Virginia, a year later, finds themselves winning it all, crushing through the tournament, leaving no doubt that they were the best team in that tournament. And won it all? Come April, I guess, right?
Yep, come April. They won the title there. You know what else is in April there, man? I'll see you there. At
the Masters. Yeah. And the Big Cat, another GOAT doing GOAT things, the Big Cat, Tiger, showed us that he can win a major. He can win a major golf tournament again. Even it is the Masters, which he's dominated that course for how long, but it was nice to see Tiger, get his major championship. Then, we move along throughout the summer. Baseball's being played. The playoff, we talked about it earlier. The playoff picture was shaping up, and who would have thought come October you would have had, what we saw, like the Washington Nationals.
Winning
like,
their first
World Series, like that's incredible. And then also, you're finishing up basketball season there, over the summer in June, and you saw two one of the greatest players of this decade, arguably, go down with a Achilles tear with Kevin Durant. Klay Thompson goes down in the finals with an ACL tear. And Kawhi Leonard just does Kawhi Leonard things and wins another championship for Toronto's first ever. And on his path, man, he had that unbelievable shot in Game 7.
Game 7 against Philadelphia.
That unbelievable shot. That was amazing.
The little kiss.
Yeah. And then now we're here. We've seen, we're going to be looking at a college football playoff coming up Saturday. 2 big semifinal games, which, I think the Ohio State game can go either way, the Ohio State-Clemson game, and then, you have LSU-Oklahoma. I really think that's going to be a one-sided matchup, but that's why they play the game. So, I mean, that's what I have. You want to add anything into that, Core, for our 2019 review?
No, it's been a really good year. I'd say outside of the state of Ohio for sports, pretty much. The state of Ohio for sports has not been too kind. Obviously in Cincinnati, we have a little bit, obviously the Bengals with, one victory, clinching the number 1 seed. So 2020 is already
on another disappointing season.
Very disappointing. But the Bengals, hey, a positive note, we got the number 1 pick. We're on the clock. So we'll kind of see what happens there. Obviously, like you said, the Browns disappointing, had all the talent in the world, and they're not making the playoffs. It's just depressing. It's very, very depressing for Cincinnati. The Reds were not good. The Indians were not as good as they were expected to be. It's very, very depressing.
Yeah, it was definitely a down year for Ohio sports outside of the Buckeyes. If I'm just being honest, But Corey, let's just recap here, since you were already talking about, we were talking about the Bengals, the Browns, but you also mentioned the Reds and the Indians. Why don't you go ahead and lead us off here with a MLB decade review? So that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of the show. We're going to do a decade, just an every sport decade review. So Corey, kick us off here with the MLB.
Okay, so decade here, 2010 up until to the end of 2019. Obviously I've kind of found about 10 storylines that I kind of want to hit on and touch on about baseball here. Obviously, number one, congrats all around. I don't like them very much. The city is fun. The Chicago Cubs win the World Series.
Congratulations. Yeah, that was, what was it, 119 something odd years?
Just too many. 2016, right. The Chicago Cubs win the World Series. That's got to be number one.
As one of my favorite people in the world said, Doc, or not, he didn't say it, but like they said in Back to the Future, actually, sorry. As they said in Back to the Future, I wish I could go back and put some money on the Cubbies. Because, the odds that they were going to win it were crazy. But, I like that World Series, though, because it involved the Indians. So, with that going 2016, man, that World Series was just incredible. Either way, you were going to see a team who hasn't won it in how long. They were finally going to... We were going to see history either way, and that's what I loved about that World Series. There was a lot of history this decade at the MLB. Alrighty,
so number two, probably the best player in the Major League Baseball still to this day, whether he's hurt or not. I think he's the best player good at baseball. Mike Trout arrives for Major League Baseball. I mean, at 27, he is arguably putting up bigger numbers and a better WAR stat, which is how they pretty much say you're good at baseball or not, the WAR stat. He's 27 years old now, and he is at a 72.5. All right, now just to let you know how good that is, Babe Ruth and Barry Bonds, who are arguably two of the greatest players in baseball history, according to Baseball Reference's version, put up 50.3 for their career. 50.3. Mike Trout at his 27-year-old season right now is at 72.5 for his career. Welcome to the MLB in this decade.
Yeah, he's had a great decade. We were talking earlier about the World Series champions. It's crazy to think that the Giants started the decade 3-5, it looks like.
They did. 2010, 2012, 2014.
Yeah, that's crazy.
3 and 5 years.
And then the Red Sox picked up where they left off in the last decade, winning a couple more. We saw the Nationals win their first one, as we were saying earlier.
You also saw the rise and fall, and then the rise and fall of the Houston Astros. They went from the Lastros to the champion Astros. They won, obviously, winning a championship there, bringing that back.
And you know what I see on this list, which is insane to really think about, considering how dominant this franchise has been. This is the first decade the Yankees did not win a World Series. Isn't that kind of...
Not win. They didn't make it. They didn't even make a World. They didn't even play in a World Series. So that's it's a very shocking stat.
Yeah.
One thing I also wanted to point out that was kind of on my list here is something you thought you would never see in baseball. Just like, a triple-double, averaging a triple-double is not something you see every day in the NBA game. Winning the Triple Crown in baseball, Miguel Cabrera.
Oh, wow.
Won the Triple Crown and the MVP, took it away from Mike Trout for 1 year. But other than that, Miguel Cabrera wins the Triple Crown. Obviously, I've always loved Miguel Cabrera. Miggy, love the guy. I think he's a good person. He's good at baseball. He's arguably, before he had this recent injury proneness in the last couple of years, maybe the best hitter could be possibly the best hitter ever. Just unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, Aaron Judge, though. I mean, not what we're seeing out of him, though. But, I mean, he's still young. No, but Mickey, I mean, he's definitely one of the best. It sucks that he got injury prone, you know? Would have loved to see what he would have been able to do. What else do you got for us, Core?
You know, you already mentioned the Yankees not making a World Series. That's just kind of...
That's shocking.
Just it's unbelievable. And, you know, the other thing we never thought is Albert Pujols. Albert Pujols signed with the Angels. He left St. Louis and signed with the Angels. That was kind of my last topic there. Overall, probably one of the better decades in baseball sports in a while. Obviously, you had instant replay grow. Obviously, that's changing the way baseball's played now as well. But, you know, the game of baseball, again, just the last decade, just a great year for baseball. A lot of things happened. A lot of new things happened that you weren't expecting.
Wasn't the replay involved this decade? Wasn't that introduced?
Yep,
like there was a lot of
that was
the
they
pitch
made,
clock
yep,
as well.
They've added other things into the game to try to speed it up. Again, a good decade for baseball. And, you know, it's just you see a lot more hitters, a lot more. It's more of a hitters league, but you still, when you need it the most, it's a pitchers league when it comes down to it. And you've got a lot of good
Can't
pitchers
win without pitching.
A lot of good pitchers, a lot of good hitters, a lot of young talent in the MLB right now, and it's just been a great decade.
Yeah, can't wait to see what this next decade has in store for us for the MLB. All right, Core. Well, let's just move on to the NBA here. Talk some professional basketball. Give that review. It was kind of a crazy year. It seemed only like a few teams, especially the latter part of this decade. You know, the Warriors pretty much dominated it, making all the finals. LeBron dominated. The early part of the decade going into the mid part of the decade as well. But, what really stuck out to me this early decade was LeBron's, the entire LeBron saga, if I must say. The decision that he did when he left Cleveland to go to Miami, and then going back to Cleveland, and then leaving Cleveland, and then going to Los Angeles. Like, it just seemed like there was just like a lot of LeBron movement saga going on. And what always stuck out to me the most this part of this decade has been, or, throughout that entire LeBron saga, was when he got to Miami. We all saw it. They were doing their, hype thing, whatever. And he goes, not one, not two, not three. Oh, right, LeBron. You guys didn't get 3. You guys only got 2. You made it there 4 times, but you only won twice. So that, looking back on it, that's kind of funny that, they went out there and said not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, not 5, not 6, not 7. And kind of what that statement was like, he was never going to leave Miami. That's where he was going to finish out his professional career. And it's just kind of, looking back on it, Corey, it's just kind of interesting to see how everything played out.
Yeah, I mean, LeBron dominated this decade just like he did the decade before. But again, just like the decade before, he dominated it without winning a lot of championships. I mean, he's got the same amount of rings. How many rings? 4? 3? 3 rings?
3 rings this decade.
Draymond Green, Steph, Clay, they all have 3, and they won 3 in 5 years. Durant has 2. Probably would have won a third if he wouldn't have gotten hurt. That's pretty much, they dominated the league. 2010 we saw, from 2010 on we saw the likes of the NBA change. You saw a lot of...
There was a passing of a torch, if you will.
Absolutely. There were greats that left the game. Kobe.
Dwayne Wade.
Dirk.
Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, Tim Duncan. I mean, that's kind of like an entire generation. I mean, we really grew up during, the 90s era. But, throughout our teen years, that's who we saw play basketball. Where the Tony Parker, Manu Ginobili, Tim Duncan, Kobe, Dwayne Wade, Carmelo Anthony retired and then he came back. There's just Allen Iverson.
And again, just like in baseball, you did have teams that have never won championships win championships. Cleveland, obviously LeBron brought one home to Cleveland, and then you also had Toronto.
Toronto winning it.
Toronto won, and then also Golden State. The first championship they won. Obviously, it'd been a while. I think they had won previous.
Yeah.
It'd been a long time. So it'd been a long time. But obviously, that was great.
And we saw a great finally get his. Two greats, actually, in my opinion. We saw, in 2011, Dirk and Jason Kidd beat the Heat 4-2, and Dirk finally got his ring along with Jason Kidd. To me, that was also awesome to see. Just as a fan, I was so happy for Dirk when he won that championship.
Well deserving.
He was so well deserving. The Spurs even won a championship this decade with Kawhi Leonard, Tony Parker, Danny Green, Manu Ginobili, Tim Duncan. All those guys. This NBA decade, if you're looking at it from a matchup standpoint in the finals, it looked really boring. Almost, seeing like the same people always in it. But look, LeBron did something that nobody has done since Bill Russell, to my knowledge. He went to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. He went to 8 finals in a row.
Counting.
No, he went to 8 finals.
They were out last year.
Sure, yeah,
they were out last year. 8 straight.
8 straight. Like, that's even incredible to think about.
Yeah, it was, again, another great year. Great decade for basketball. The game has evolved a whole lot. It's a 3-point game now more than anything.
Steph Curry.
Yep.
Changed basketball.
It's definitely a 3-point game now. So, it's obviously you still have some big guys that are still dominating the league. But other than that, it's been a heck of a decade. It was just fun to watch. Fun to watch basketball.
And people get on me for kind of saying this, but, Steph Curry changed the league in this decade. He really did. When you go to a park now, you don't see, kids driving into the paint, trying to dunk. They do still try to dunk on people, but, you see kids shooting threes. And not only that, like kids doing it more like even in the middle school, high school, college era, the women are even shooting more threes now. When you watch women's basketball, they're shooting way more threes. And that's evolving the game to a different level. Steph has shot the three better than we've ever seen anybody in the history of the game shoot it. And that's not like just how he makes them or, how many he's made. It's also the range that he's made those threes at, too. It's just been unprecedented. Steph Curry changed the league in one decade.
Yeah, a phenomenal player. And the one thing that I do like to point out, outside of the addition of Kevin Durant, that team was still very good, even without. Obviously, this year you can't count it against them, but next year we could be talking about them, in 10 years from now as well. In 10 years from now, we could say the 2020s was a good decade for the Warriors. Obviously, they're the third youngest team in the NBA right now. Their oldest player is Steph Curry. He's not going anywhere. I think the core lineup they have is good.
Clay said there's no reason for him to ever leave. He loves playing in the Bay.
Draymond's locked up.
Draymond's out.
The only piece is D'Angelo Russell. They might try to get rid of him to bring in somebody else.
Rumors are they're going after Giannis.
But we'll see. We'll see what happens. But obviously, for a decade, the NBA was a great decade as well.
Yeah. And it was also nice to see, Tim Duncan and all those guys finish out with a ring after they lost to the Heat, the year before. That was just, Tim Duncan winning another ring. You can never be mad at those guys. He's
probably the best power forward ever.
Yeah, oh, definitely. But you know what I liked most about those guys and what I miss seeing, sometimes they carry themselves very well on and off the court. You never heard any, of rumors or anything coming out like, oh, Tim Duncan's unhappy or Tony Parker's unhappy. Manu wants to be a starter. No, they all knew what they needed to do to win, and they went out there and did it. I just loved all that entire trio that they had there in San Antonio. So, Court.
Yeah, so the next, I think, topic that we should really bring up, the National Football League.
Yeah.
I mean, 2010 to 2019, what happened? I think the same thing that's been happening. Tom Brady is still winning championships. They're still a dominant force through this decade. The biggest comeback in Super Bowl history happened this decade.
A near perfect. Oh, no, the perfect season wasn't this decade. That was last decade.
That was not this decade. You also had the Philly Special to defeat Tom Brady. That was nice. The Eagles brought a championship back.
To kick off the decade, you had what nobody thought imaginable would happen. An onside kick to kick off the second half of the Super Bowl. With Sean Payne making that call. That was an incredible moment. I'm glad I watched it. Just speaking of incredible moments. And then another incredible moment that comes to mind when you're speaking of Tom Brady and him losing in the Super Bowl is that Mario Manningham catch.
Eli Manning, his second championship.
Rated one of the worst quarterbacks ever won a Super Bowl, but
Gruden was back in the NFL this decade. Still not great, but okay, he's back.
We saw the brothers face off in a Super Bowl. The Har Bowl.
You did? You saw Colin Kaepernick. That saga come to an end this decade.
Start and then take off this decade.
I think
crazy.
This decade you had the rise of the running backs early in this decade, and then later on in the decade it became more about the quarterbacks. And you had unbelievable seasons. Adrian Peterson comes to mind.
Yeah.
Pretty much Adrian Peterson.
Jamal Charles had a heck of a year. They all in the running back position has evolved a ton this decade. You also have more controversy with the referees this decade. You have blown calls. In the
Absolutely.
NFC Championship. I mean, and rule changes because of it come along. Now you're, challenging what could or could not be pass interference being called. Just game-changing rules that have came out in the NFL. We saw Pete Carroll not give the ball to Marshawn Lynch on the 1-yard line in the Super Bowl. We saw him throw the ball. Pete Carroll, if you were at USC in the national championship game in that exact situation with Matt Leinart and Reggie Bush right behind, right there, who are you going to give the ball to? Are you going to throw it? No, I remember you did a Bush push. You know what I'm saying? Like we just saw that. Like we saw a meltdown, like you were talking earlier, Corey, the meltdown of the Atlanta Falcons.
Yeah, it's been, again, for this decade, I can't even believe that the decade's over. I can't even believe it. The NFL has just been, it's been a crazy couple decades, or just decade, as for speaking of, let's talk about the Ohio teams. Bengals were pretty decent this decade. Still haven't won a playoff game.
But they started out decent.
They
and
were
now
decent,
they're the number one pick.
And now they're the number one pick. So kind of from decent to worst, and then you have the worst team, the Browns, going to decent, worst to decent. So
yeah.
They've been bad.
Decent.
You want to talk about bad? The Jets, they've been bad. The Dolphins, they're bad.
Look where Antonio Brown was at the beginning of this decade.
The Antonio Brown saga completely.
It's
wild. It's just crazy things happen in the NFL. Just Gronkowski's career ends this decade.
Yeah,
Marshawn Lynch leaves and comes back.
You know what I was thinking about today when I was just watching Sports Center in the break room and they were talking about Marshawn Lynch. I was thinking about how funny would it be if they meet the Patriots in the Super Bowl again and it's the same situation and Pete Carroll doesn't give the ball to Marshawn again. I was thinking how funny that would be.
Yeah, it would be comical. But again, I think the NFL, out of all the decades, I think the NFL probably had the best decade.
Oh yeah,
definitely.
I mean, I'm looking here. 2014, Russell Wilson took the NFL by storm by steamrolling a Peyton Manning team that we thought nobody was going to beat. We saw Peyton Manning retire this decade. We saw one of the possible greats just retire this season, earlier this year. This decade in the NFL, I mean, it's been a wild decade. Who would have thought Nick Foles would be a Super Bowl winning quarterback?
Yeah, again, like we talked about, the Eagles won the championship, made the city of Philadelphia go nuts and wild. That was one of probably the better moments here. I think my favorite moment of the NFL, people don't like it. I really liked Tom Brady's comeback. I think that's the biggest thing that happened this decade in the NFL. It just, you didn't think, everyone goes, wow, the Falcons are for real. 28-3. 28-3. And what does Tom Brady do? Cool as a cucumber. Slow and steady. Comes back, knows his defense is going to do it. He knows he needs to happen. And what happens? He dumps it off. He nickels and dimes you all the way down the field.
In 2 to 3 minutes
and
each
then
drive.
Right when you think he's dropping back, play action, hands it off for the touchdown in overtime to win. Just unbelievable.
And I think that was the first Super Bowl ever to go to overtime. We saw. My favorite moment in this decade, it's hard to pick because I always earlier this decade, you can never remember Aaron Rodgers went over the Steelers. I mean, both of us being from Ohio, that was awesome to watch. The Steelers losing in the Super Bowl. The lights go out in the Harbaugh Bowl. That was kind of crazy.
Changed the whole game.
Changed the entire game. But yeah, I mean, and then you have the Philly special in 2018. But you're right. I mean, the comeback, the largest comeback in Super Bowl history, the first Super Bowl to go to overtime, and who else to do it but the GOAT, Tom Brady. That's what, you're right. I mean, that's just the one that sticks out to me the most. And then he closes out this decade with a Super Bowl. He's just amazing. Anything else you would like to add in this decade, Cory? Any last thoughts on the NFL for this decade?
I really don't. The teams that you thought were going to be good were good, pretty much. And the teams that weren't going to be good aren't good. So, I mean, not too much of a surprise there. I mean, you had big trades happen, and, you had bust picks. But, overall, great decade.
Yeah, definitely. And what a decade college basketball actually had. As I was saying earlier, we saw the first 16 seed upset that number 1. That was incredible.
You did. You also had, in this decade in college basketball, early in the decade, you saw Kemba Walker. And you know what Kemba Walker did at Connecticut? What, he went 4 games in 4 days to win the Big East championship at Madison Square Garden? 5 games. I think 5 games in 5 days, right? And
yes,
great
sir.
guard play led him all the way to a national title.
Kevin Ollie's rookie year, and he's not even the coach there anymore. That's kind of crazy to think about as well.
Yeah, I was looking that earlier. Connecticut Sports Decade in Review. If you look at that, the men's basketball team continued collecting titles as the 2000s began, and then by the mid-decade, trouble is brewing. So, Jim Calhoun got out at the right time. Kevin Ollie, I think, is a good basketball coach, but I think some issues happened here and there, and so he's no longer there.
Speaking of trouble, though, when trouble starts brewing, Louisville wins a national championship, then has to vacate it because of Rick Pitino. And that entire saga, that was a huge thing coming out of college basketball in the early part of this decade. One thing that kills me to think about is when it is to think that Michigan went to two finals this decade. You saw Butler go to back-to-back finals.
I mean, as a fan, it was fun to watch. I mean, you had phenomenal shots being made. Obviously, this decade is still dominated. It was dominated early on in the decades by your powerhouses. But you still get, and that's the great thing about college basketball. College basketball, anyone can win at any moment. But, obviously, if you're talking about great players, great teams, you're going to talk about Duke. You're going to talk about North Carolina. You're going to talk about Kentucky.
The surprise, Villanova
Villanova has become
to dominance.
They did. Villanova has become relevant again. Great job, Jay Wright. I think he's going to become an NBA coach here probably in the next couple of years. But, Villanova rose. Obviously, you saw Virginia win, going from worst to first. That was nice.
I don't remember if this was this decade or the last decade, but I believe this decade we saw the undefeated Wildcats lose. In this decade.
That's correct.
I mean, we kicked this decade off in March Madness, right? First March Madness of the decade, you saw the championship game go down to a Gordon Hayward heave from half court to that bounce off the rim. There was just a lot of magical things, and then the next year they're back in it. Kentucky won this year. Louisville won this decade. Duke wins another one in 2015 over Wisconsin, which was a heck of a game that really was, if you will, Grayson Allen's coming out party. I remember watching that game, and he was the momentum changer that they needed late in that game, and I just expected way more than what came from him in his tripping saga, that he got caught up in. North Carolina goes to back-to-back title games, splits them. I remember watching that one against Villanova. I know you were too, because we called each other right afterwards. But thinking, North Carolina just tied in and we're going into overtime. And then here comes Jenkins. Boom, 3-game winner. Let the confetti fall.
Unreal shot, unreal moment.
Right.
Obviously my favorite part of March is the review. It is the one shining moment at the end. That's my favorite part. But, college basketball, I think it was filled with a lot of dirt, pretty much. A lot of things happened to different coaches. You saw a lot of them leaving leaving due to that. And I think that's what you kind of look at this decade. Look at Rick Pitino. Obviously that sticks out the most. But other guys, other NCAA programs, you had a lot of different coaching changes.
Arizona had a lot of things were under investigation. Clemson was under investigation by the FBI.
A lot of rumors and a lot of things, dark cloud over the NCAA decade. But for basketball, at the end of the day, you still had some hope because you still saw Virginia bounce back. And I think that's probably the story that would probably talk of the decade is probably how Virginia lost as a number 1 seed. All of those guys decided, it's on us. We're coming back. And to come back and win a national title, unreal. Unreal.
And you saw the one and dones. We've been looking at that for a while, but it's really been prominent this decade. Look what Duke did. They had their entire team one year was one and dones. They just couldn't get it done. So I think what you saw, in college basketball especially this year or in this decade was experience matters, getting those players who are not the one-and-done athletes and grooming them, for 4 years. You saw that's what sustained greatness in this decade. So that's a positive note, for a lot of programs out there. Looking back on it, Michigan wouldn't have been able what they did with one-and-done athletes. Villanova wouldn't have been able to do it. North Carolina wouldn't have been able to do it. Duke wouldn't have been able to win 2 titles if they had one-and-dones. I mean, that 2010 team, they had 3 seniors. So I think what we've actually seen, and on the negative side of that, is the one-and-done has almost ruined college basketball this decade. But I mean, those are my final thoughts on college basketball. I don't know about you, Cory.
Nothing else. Obviously March is coming soon, so March Madness, hello.
Yeah. Well, it's time for college football decade in review. So we can, you can't talk about college basketball without mentioning football. Kind of a crazy decade, if you will. I mean, Alabama really asserted dominance like they did in the latter part of the last decade as well.
You had the introduction of the college football playoff this decade. Still, in my opinion, it is a good system. I think it's
could use improvement.
It definitely can. There definitely can be improvement. One thing that really stands out, it happened against Michigan, but, the one thing that kind of stands out is you have great players making great plays. And not that you don't always see that, but, you talk about the number 1 player in the country out of the 2011 class, Jadeveon Clowney. When you think about him in college, you think about the hit he put on in the bowl game against Michigan. Vincent Smith didn't have a chance. Now, granted, what you don't know is karma happens to teams when you actually play, and Michigan fumbled the football and South Carolina recovered the play beforehand, and they reviewed it and said that it wasn't a fumble, even though it was completely a fumble. So what happened? The next play, Jadeveon Clowney blows him up. He fumbles. He recovers. South Carolina football. Should have been that way the first time. But
what also stands out, just speaking about Jadeveon Clowney, what sticks out to me is what he actually started in college. He was the first one to really, a major athlete, to say, I'm sitting out. I'm not going to risk coming back and having an injury and risking my draft stock. We've seen that domino effect where now, like Leonard Fournette, sitting out bowl games. Don't want to get injured. It's unnecessary if we're not playing in the playoff.
But Leonard Fournette did have a monster college career, and he was in the 2014 class.
But because of Jadeveon Clowney, that was a domino effect that we've seen. I mean, Michigan had 2 guys sit out last year because they didn't want to get injured.
This decade, you also saw the rise of the defensive linemen. This decade, I mean, it doesn't even matter team. They all are good. Alabama, Georgia, Notre Dame, Michigan, Ohio State, Clemson. Wisconsin even has some good ones in there, J.J. Watt. I mean, they've got some good ones in there, too. So, I mean, you're looking at defensive linemen. I mean, it's just unbelievable. I mean, you talk about defensive linemen. You also, you talk about some of these guys. I mean, even still.
You had Jadeveon Clowney in the top 5. You had both Bosa's in the top 5. Chubb out of Georgia was in the top 5. I don't remember their names, but I know Clemson had a couple guys last year in the top 10 of defensive linemen, if not 3.
I mean, first rounders. It was an unbelievable decade for defensive linemen. You also had quarterbacks. Obviously, good quarterbacks this decade. I mean, you have Tua, Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields. Those are just guys that are around now. I mean, previous to that, Jake Fromm back there. He's still in college.
I mean, just some would come to mind. I mean, J.T. Barrett was a good college quarterback. You had Marcus Mariota, Heisman winner.
Baker Mayfield,
Kyler Murray. You had Jameis Winston, Heisman winner. Cam Newton, Heisman winner. A.J. McCarron played, I believe, in this decade. Out of Alabama. I mean, when you just look at it, all these guys are amazing. You know, the quarterback play this decade has been unreal. Seen a lot of things that we never would have thought we've seen, for sure. I never.
A lot of coaching changes as well.
Yeah.
Some big names going to
Urban
big
Meyer
plays.
came home to Ohio State after leaving Florida this decade.
Jim Harbaugh came home to Michigan. You had a lot of Nick
the rise
Saban.
Of
You had
Dabo Swinney.
Dabo Swinney, absolutely. You had a lot of. I was just about to say you have a lot of Alabama.
And if I'm not
coordinators go places.
Yeah. And if I'm not mistaken, Brian Kelly left Cincinnati at the start of the decade to take over the Notre Dame job.
He did.
Yeah.
And they're not as good as they should be.
Right. Those are, coaching change. Jimbo Fisher leaves Florida State after, what he started there. That was kind of, weird to see him leave there to go to Texas A&M. Speaking of the college football playoff, like you were talking earlier, Cory, Ohio State was the inaugural champion. Alabama won I believe.
Too many.
Just too many. I mean, they won 2015, 2017, and they played in it pretty much every year. And it's kind of refreshing this year. We're not going to see Alabama have the chance to win a national championship. It's refreshing to see.
It is definitely refreshing. Definitely refreshing to see them not in there. Obviously, I'd like to see a year where the SEC doesn't make it at all. That would be the year. But, I think the SEC has just kind of dominated this decade. I mean, you have the Big Ten and SEC more than likely. Obviously, years past, you probably had the Pac-12 with USC. But, I mean, the SEC has dominated this decade.
Yeah, they definitely have. Go from championship perspectives, they have. But it's not even really the SEC. It's more or less just Alabama, if I'm just being honest.
And LSU every 4 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, LSU, but LSU lost to Alabama. So if you're just talking championships, your only two are Auburn and Alabama who've won it out of the SEC.
Yeah, and again, you want to talk about quarterbacks. Cam Newton was this decade at 2010, I believe, as well.
And you know what else we saw this decade that comes to mind? Auburn's going to win the football game. Auburn's going to win the football game. The kick six, the 109-yard return against Alabama. That was incredible. That was just an incredible moment in college football. Man, what a decade we've had just looking back on it. I know our teams have had their ups and downs. Michigan started this decade with Rich Rodriguez, 3-9.
Yeah, it's been kind of rockier for Michigan than it has Ohio State, but I think the 2020s are going to be a good to Michigan. I think you started to see. Obviously Ohio State was way ahead, and obviously is still ahead a little bit. But as you can see, there are strides being made that it's getting to where it's back to being a little bit closer. So I think you're going to see that kind of in the future change a little bit. But I mean, obviously, we're back to being where we should be. We're back. We're not losing
conversation.
We're not losing to teams we shouldn't be losing to.
Exactly.
And I think so that's kind of where we're at there. Obviously Ohio State's been solid, winning a championship, the first ever college football playoff. Other than that, college football, my favorite sport. But I mean, decade-wise, it's been fun introducing new things. I hope they introduce more new things come the 2020s.
Yeah, it's gonna be. I can't wait for the next decade of college football. Urban Meyer left Ohio State this decade to see Ryan Day take over, so I'm excited about that as a Buckeye fan looking, this next decade coming up. It's just it was just a great decade for sports, so, as we've been talking, all these memories are just coming back.
I know you said you wanted to bring up, obviously tennis has
Let
been
me tell you about the greatest athlete that this world has ever seen, Serena Williams. Okay, she has done more in her as a woman tennis player than even the men have done. She won a Grand Slam this decade pregnant, people. She won She went out and played in the hardest tennis tournament to win, the Australian Open, while pregnant, and won. Even though she has not won a Grand Slam in the past 2 years, to close out this decade, she dominated it. She won the Australian in 2010, 15, 17, won the French 13, 15, won Wimbledon, her tournament 2010, 2012, 2015, 2016, and then won the U.S. Open in 2012, 13, and 14. I mean, she won more Grand Slams than more people have won this decade. She did it in 5 years.
Yeah, she is definitely...
She won 10 Grand Slams in 5 years.
Yep, she's definitely the best ever. Will probably win a couple more next year. I'm not worried about it. She's probably the best female athlete. Maybe you could consider maybe ever.
Player ever.
Greatest tennis player ever. She's a phenomenal athlete. She could be the best one of the best female athletes ever. I'd put
her up there with the greatest ever.
Right.
Athlete,
it's unbelievable. And so, I think obviously from a male tennis standpoint, obviously you had Federer,
boy Roger.
Yeah, Roger Federer obviously dominated the previous decade, but he's still around. He's still fighting. He's made a Grand Slam final in 10 straight years, which is an open era record. It's been unbelievable, and he's a phenomenal player. I'm not a huge fan of him. He's a great tennis player.
He's definitely one of the best male tennis players ever. I think this decade you saw maybe the best ever. Obviously, you saw the best ever on clay, Rafael Nadal. I know you. That's your boy. That's my boy. I love Rafi. Let me tell you, he won the 2010, 11, 12, 13, 14, 17, 18, and 19 French Opens. He won 8 in a decade. That's unheard of. No other player has even won 10 single Open titles, like at one tournament. Roger hasn't even done that, and he did 8 in 1 year or 1 decade. That's incredible. He did win a Wimbledon title. He won the U.S. 4 times, especially closing out this 2019 season, winning he won the French and the U.S. Rafi, him and Djokovic really dominated this decade in tennis.
Yeah, Djokovic won 16 Grand Slams. 16 in this decade. I'm sorry.
That's incredible.
15 in this decade.
Oh, but that's still incredible.
He won 1 in 2008. He's won the Australian Open this decade. He won 2011, 2012, 2013, 2015, 2016, 2019.
And let me tell you something. For our listeners out there who may be like, oh, tennis, how could, they be considered one of the best athletes? Let me tell you what goes into tennis. There's conditioning, because you're out on that court for 3.5 hours. Okay? You're hitting a ball at 120 miles an hour every single time you stroke it. You stroke your racket. Okay? And not only that, you're using every single muscle in your body to play that sport. I just want to give our listeners a background about why this is incredible, what these people are doing.
No, absolutely, you're absolutely right. It's definitely one of the more sports that you need to be most conditioned for. Obviously going back to Novak, I think he has the potential to become the best ever. Obviously, at 32 years old, Nadal will be around, and Nadal is tough on clay. But I think if Djokovic wins Australian, U.S. Open, and Wimbledon, and Nadal wins the French, he's going to pass Nadal. He's going to pass Federer. He's at 16 already. And this year, he won 2, Wimbledon and Australian Open. In 2011, Djokovic probably had his best year. He won the Australian, the U.S. Open, and Wimbledon, just losing in the French. I think he's going to become the best ever. I always thought growing up, obviously, it was Pete Sampras. 100% it was Pete Sampras. But, Federer kind of took that title from him. And you have to think, Pete Sampras won what, 12?
I don't. I would have to. Look
I think like somewhere around the 12. I think 12.
I think he's up there.
Maybe 12. Maybe around 12
I think
to
he's
14.
Probably in the anywhere from the 15 to 19 range. If I hear.
Okay. You might be right. I think maybe 15 sounds right. 15 does kind of sound right. But Pete Sampras dominated, and then Roger Federer came along, kind of took that from him, and then you kind of had Nadal kind of take it from Federer, and then you kind of had Djokovic kind of take it from Nadal.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's kind of been, decade-wise, it's kind of leading up. Tennis kind of always falls the same way. You've got a couple guys.
One thing I would love to point out this decade of tennis was a Brit won the U.S. Open. Or not the U.S., I'm sorry. A Brit won Wimbledon. Andy Murray. And, if you don't follow tennis, Andy Murray has since retired due to back complications, being hard on his, being the sport being as demanding as it is on your body. He had to retire at a young age. But that was one of my favorite moments in tennis. I got to say, I was watching Andy Murray win that Wimbledon title. Not only what it probably meant to him, but what it meant to their entire, country. What he was actually really playing for. It was just an incredible tennis moment. So happy for him. I mean, Rafael Nadal had one of the greatest. I mean, he's the greatest player on clay ever, the king of clay, as they call him. He had one of the greatest French Open decades that anybody has ever had. I mean, to be honest, any player has ever had in any Open to win 8 of them in a decade. That's flipping incredible. Roger just moseyed on in there, won his majors when he could, took his shots, but he's always there. Like you said, he made that. Then that's even incredible to think about, that he made 10 straight, or he made 10 finals. He made one every year this decade, so he made 10 total finals this decade. That's incredible to even think about. And when some players don't even get to one in their entire career. I mean, one of my favorites retired this decade, Andy Roddick. He won one, and that was the 2003 U.S. Open. And to my knowledge, the best of my knowledge, he only played in a few more, like I would say probably tops 5 finals for the rest of his career after 2003. So, Cor, let's wrap it up here with our shout-outs. So, who would you like your shout-out of the greatest sports moment this decade, in your opinion?
It's really tough. The one moment that stands out this decade, it has to be Pete Carroll not running the football. I mean, my shout-out, obviously my shout-out's going to go to Malcolm Butler. Obviously, I mean, he made the play. I mean, to know that.
To have that instinct.
Moment, to see him cutting that way,
to
go doing it. Now, granted, let's not take away the play before that where Kearse made that bobbling catch to get them in position. But, a couple plays before that. But I think that's where my shout-out's going to go to Malcolm Butler. I think that's the play that defined this decade. I mean, this decade, obviously, Tom Brady only has 5 if that doesn't happen.
Right.
So, I mean, I think...
Or the Philly special doesn't happen, and he could still have 6. But, no, I get your point.
I think things... Again, the game is a crazy place.
Right.
Things can happen. I would give it to him because I think that was the craziest play.
Yeah, definitely. As you were giving yours, man, I was racking my brain a little bit about mine, and I have to go to UMBC for being the first 16 seed ever to upset a number 1. That was just a magical moment that I never thought I was going to be able to experience.
Yeah, that's a moment that you will think back when you are 80 years old and you will say, I watched that. I physically watched that happen. And when I'm 80 years old, 50 years from now, there may not be another 16 seed that beats a 1
Exactly,
seed.
and I could tell my grandkids, I saw that 1 in that column. I watched that. How mad that's just my shout out. Shout out to them, because you gave me probably one of the most magical moments I will never forget in all of sports. Well, guys, that's all we have for you. Please don't forget to check out our sister podcast, the OHIO podcast, for all your Ohio State football needs, if that's your thing.
And don't forget to catch us every Friday on Podbean, Apple Podcast, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and we're also on Spotify or wherever else you would get your podcast needs. Just search 513 Sports Attack. Also, check out our Facebook page at 513 Sports Attack. We're also on Instagram at the 513 Sports Attack. And if you have any questions for us, please send us an email at the 513 Sports Attack at gmail.com.
Don't forget to hit subscribe, and please give us a 5-star rating.